Welcome everyone to today's devotion. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If my math is right, by the end of this week, we'll almost be done with 1 Corinthians. So next Tuesday, I believe, we will conclude our study of this book, one of the longer books of Paul. And I think the next book we're going into is 2 Corinthians. So again, the New Testament isn't as long and intimidating as we often make it. In chapter 10, Paul's returning to some of the major themes he's been dealing with. One is just the struggle, our daily struggle with sin, and another is the ethical question of giving meat sacrificed to idols. Now remember, when we talk about the meat sacrificed to idols, that may not be something that we struggle with in our age, but the reality is there are a lot of gray areas of really, a better way to describe it is areas of Christian liberty that we continue to disagree on. And Paul provides for us a model by which we can love each other in a charitable way, recognizing differences on matters of Christian liberty. I want to first start with what he says about some of the practical living stuff. Notice the first 5 verses. He goes back to the Old Testament, particularly the story of the Exodus. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all who were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. The rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. What Paul's main point here, and he's going to make the experience of the Jews in the wilderness his primary model, illustration, if you will, in chapter 10. But you see here, he says, look, everyone came out of the wilderness. Look, they were all baptized in the same water. They were all under the same cloud. They were all they all ate the same spiritual food. Now you'll notice what Paul's doing here. He's showing us that the model we have in the narrative, there's a spiritual model there too. If you'll go back to our discussion of Matthew, we follow this model. So Paul teaches us how to read the Bible here. Now, what I'm not saying is to spiritualize the Bible. What I'm saying is go where the Bible takes you purposefully. So Paul will say, look, all of them were redeemed. All of them were set free, and all of them went through the process of baptism. That's the Red Sea narrative. If you don't agree with that interpretation, look at the baptism of Jesus. It's the same story where he goes from the baptism into the wilderness for 40 days, 40 nights, as the Israelites went to the Red Sea and were in the wilderness for 40 years. And he says they're in the wilderness, they faced temptation, they did all of this. So although they all drank from the spiritual rock, the rock is Christ. You remember the story that Moses struck the rock, and from that rock came water, right? Because before all they had was the bitter water. Now they have fresh, clean, pure water that they can drink, and their cattle and everything else can drink. And Paul says, look, ultimately, in view of what Christ has done, Christ is that rock, which is why when Moses struck the rock twice, that was quite serious, because it was a denial of the gospel. The gospel says that Jesus' singular death was sufficient for all eternity. And Moses ultimately rejects that in striking the rock a second time. But nevertheless, most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. That is to say that though they had experienced the work of God, though they had seen the work of God, they had received the work of God, they still disobeyed the will of God. And as a result, God was displeased with them. And Paul is warning the Corinthians here, don't go the way of your forefathers. Now, not everyone in Corinth is a Jew. But in light of Christ, he'll make this argument in Galatians. We've talked about the book Galatians. We are all one in Christ, and in Christ we are sons of Abraham, daughters of Abraham. So with the experience, the wilderness experience in mind, he then warns us not to do the same things they did. So verse 6, he says this was an example to us, and so that we would live godly lives and not make the mistakes they make. So first mistake they made is that they desired evil. And the second was verse 7, they were idolaters. So do not be idolaters, as some of them were. at the end of the day, that it really is, and he'll return to this in verse 14, flee from idolatry. At the end of the day, that is the root issue of all of our sin. What lies behind every sin is both selfishness and idolatry. Because idolatry, at the end of the day, is the worship of the self. If you're not going to worship the God who is there, we will worship a God of our imagination. And the God of our imagination always seems to like me. He may not like you, but he certainly likes me. And he wishes there were more me like there, out there, and less of you out there, right? So the root of sin is selfishness. The root of selfishness is idolatry. And you remember that they were driven by their passions and their desires and their lust, so much so they're willing to go back to Egypt. And don't forget that they literally committed idolatry in the golden calf narrative. And so when Moses comes down from the mountain, he breaks the 10 Commandments. Literally. He's got the stones, throws them down, they're broken. And he does so because what he sees at the foot of the mountain is the breaking of all 10 Commandments. So it becomes a metaphorical of what it is he witnesses. So not only should we not desire evil or be idolater, verse 8, we should not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We shouldn't put Christ to the test. In verse 10, we should not grumble. So Paul's looking at their example and saying that as we enter the world of a wilderness, as we enter into temptation, as we walk these miles of the Christian life, let us not make the mistakes of the past, but let us learn from them. Verse 12, therefore, let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. So we could add to that list of sins that the Jews committed in the wilderness, that of pride. Verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. I want you to pause and think about what he's really saying there. Because this is important considering the modern religion of secularism. Paul is saying, look, we don't look at the past and with chronological snobbery look down at them. Chronological snobbery is a technical term coined by C.S. Lewis in his autobiography. It's now it's an actual logical fallacy, and it's committed whenever we assume that I'm in the right and previous generations are in the wrong, or they're ignoramuses, or whatever, because it was before they had invented light bulbs, or before they knew there were germs. So we can't trust them, we can't learn from them because they were ignorant of these other things. That's chronological snobbery. What we see Paul saying here is, regardless of the generation or the culture or any of that, what we find is the temptations we face today are the same temptations they faced then. And so instead of standing in judgment over the past, we need to learn from the past. As Solomon was saying in Ecclesiastes, which is what we're going through on Sunday nights, there is nothing new under the sun. And now the technology may change, the language may change, the politics may change, the culture and society, all of that may change, but the heart of mankind doesn't change. And this is what makes Ecclesiastes so fascinating, is because he sees one generation rise after another. He sees that they're making the same mistakes as the previous generation, just with different hashtags. But Paul says here, look, there isn't a temptation that you're facing. It isn't common to man. Maybe differently in the way that you experience or go about it, but it's still essentially the same temptation. So whether you're the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years, Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days, or on your phone for 40 minutes, we still face the same temptations throughout the generations. But notice he says God is faithful. Despite that, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Now this is a verse a lot of people quote but can never find in the Bible. I can be guilty of that. I always think it's in Hebrews for some reason, but it's here. Yes, it is true. The promise is that God will provide the means of enduring temptation. But maybe we can reread this, because often I think we take it too far with how we interpret it. We need to realize that you will never face a temptation that God in Christ is not powerful enough to overcome. Right? That is how we need to read this. It's not that, okay, I've got a temptation over here don't worry, God will fix it by giving me a small window I can climb out of. No, no, no. It may be that this temptation will consume you for the rest of your life. But God is big enough to get you through every step of the way. That's the key. If we will run to Him, flee from idolatry, and when you flee from idolatry, you're running to something. So we have to run to Christ, the author and finisher of our faith, who has provided us a means of victory. So that's what he does here in the first 22 verses. Is he wants them to see the key issue here is that of holiness. Pursue Christ, flee idolatry, but pursue Christ. And so we need to see the balance he's providing here. In saying that eating meat sacrificed to idols is not wrong in one sense, unless it's a violation of your conscience or you're violating the conscience of someone else, he's not simultaneously saying that idolatry is good. One of the things we struggle with in our day and age is a little word called nuance. So if I were to say, just to give an example, I believe in lowering taxes. You may believe in raising taxes, but either way it'll work. So if I say I believe in lowering taxes, I'm then accused of hating poor people. I mean, immediately, no nuance, just throw out the bulveristic accusation. There you go. If you're in favor, or if I'm in favor of raising taxes, the accusation quickly is, well, then you just want to destroy the American economy. Well, you just want big brother government, don't you? No nuance. We don't believe in nuance anymore. We believe only in accusation. And that's the problem with growing influence of government and then the worship of government is that and identity politics, where everyone is in their little group, which is just cultural Marxism. All it is, your identity is not as citizen, but as victim. If you're over here, you're a homogenous group. You all think alike, you all act alike, you all dress alike. You've got your own culture, and you have your own voting habits. So Paul says, look, in saying there's liberty here, I'm not saying this, nor am I saying this. Rather, what I'm saying is that you, and all that you do it for the glory of God. So starting in verse 23 at the end of this chapter, that's his emphasis. He returns back to the meat offered to idols, but it's much bigger than that one issue. That's what we need to see. He's talking about here more than a practical question consuming the church, but the theology and the practicality behind it. So verse 23, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. That sounds familiar because he said it just a few chapters ago. I believe it's chapter 6, maybe chapter 7. Actually, I'm almost positive chapter 6. And there it had to do with sexual immorality. Now it has to do with this ethical question, practical question of eating meat sacrificed to idols. But it has to do with Christian liberty. Just because, in one sense, I'm free to do it, doesn't mean it is wise to do it. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. That's a very practical point, isn't it? It's love your neighbor as yourself. Just because you want to do it doesn't mean you should do it. And just because you can do it doesn't mean it's best for everyone. Have you ever noticed that as a parent? That's one of the difficult lessons for kids to learn. And as they age and come into the teenage years, you can see that they're in their mind, they're thinking, what I desire is not bad. It may even be a good thing. But a parent has to show, look, you've got to look beyond your little bubble and understand that, yes, this may be a good thing, may even be a right thing, but is it good for you? Is it good for others? Is it good for your neighbor? So in this instance, eating meat sacrificed to idols may be a perfectly fine thing if it doesn't violate your conscience. But is it the right thing for your neighbor? Sometimes the answer is no. So if, let's say, someone has come out of an area of temptation or an area of addiction, whatever that addiction might be, but you have some Christian liberty in that regard. I'm not going to give examples. Let's just speak in generalities. It would be foolish in understanding their temptation, their weaknesses, their addictions, to them say, well, I've got it all under control. Not that big of a deal, right? Well, it is a big of a deal because now you're violating their conscience. If someone was raised this is not something that I think we should do or I'd like to do. You showing up, beating your chest, saying, "Well, I guess I'm a strong Christian, and you're a weak Christian. I'm better than you." Well, no, you're violating their conscience here. So focus less on what makes you happy and more on what is good and right and blessing to others. So he'll go on, verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. But, he then adds, if someone says to you, hey, do you realize that meat was sacrificed to idols? Paul says, what they're communicating to you is a conscience that is being seared. Paul says, don't eat the meat. So that means at times Paul will eat such meat. At other times, he won't. He won't. That's a general Christian rule. You do good for the sake of others. But notice it's bigger than that. Verse 31, whether you eat, whether you drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. That's the key, isn't it? I mean, if you pause in every word you use, every decision you made, every deed you commit, and you ask, is my motivation for my own glory and good and praise, or is it for something bigger than me? Is it for the good and for the glory of God? We understand this, don't we? I was watching a YouTube video recently, a news story about how we're trying to streamline the COVID vaccine. And what would usually take 10 years, the goal is to do it in a year and a half. And one of the things they're doing is that they are testing young 20-somethings who are unlikely to actually die from the disease. And so they're testing them. And so they do these interviews with, why are you willing to do this? And they all answer, well, I think I'm young enough and in good enough health that the long-term effects will be mitigated. But then they all start to say, look, and they're all progressive young people, and they all had these moral arguments that they're called to live for something bigger than them. One of them was climate change. One of them was for their family and friends who might be victimized by this, right? But they all went through the decision they're making is for something bigger than them. Well, we have the ultimate big. We want everything we do to be done for the glory of God. Verse 32, give no offense to Jews or the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. If you're focused on the right things, God will bless it. But too often we lose that focus and we go back to that wilderness experience like our ancestors. Lord willing, we'll see you guys here tomorrow. I believe we'll be talking about the Lord's Supper. See you then.